It's about the restoration of our republic. We want to educate, encourage, enable the power. We stand for integrity, honesty, self-reliance, self-defense, and most importantly, no compromise on our foundational principles. This is America's Voice Now.
Find America's Voice Now on Facebook and at americasvoicenow.org. Here's Michael Evans.
All right. Welcome back. Thanks for riding with us this morning. You're listening to America's Voice Now. My name is Michael Evans. I'm your host here. Appreciate you riding with us today. We hope to spur you to seek out and gain knowledge, not that we impart, but we want to make sure that we give you the basic tools that enable you to move forward and gain education and knowledge yourself. Our goal is really just to kind of, trip your trigger, so to speak, so that you say, wow, I didn't know about that, and then you go out and do some homework and research on your own, do your own due diligence. If you're going to be a critical thinker, and that is an absolute minimum requirement now, in our society and in our world, if you're going to be a critical thinker, you have to look at all sides of the coin, right? So my goal is to just bring it to your attention and then allow you to go out there and seek your own answers, and hopefully you'll come up with enough intelligent information that you'll be able to create and formulate an opinion of your own. We never want to adopt someone else's opinion. We always want to formulate our own. If we adopt someone else's, we are, for all intents and purposes, placing ourselves behind the eight ball because, one, we're not in a position to support and defend our position if we really don't understand the foundation of why we have that position. And that's what you'll find, by the way, when you argue a point about one thing or another with a lot of folks, especially the progressive and the liberal group. Their arguments aren't hinged and based on reality and on logic and on reason. And 9 times out of 10, you'll get 1 or 2 paragraphs into the discussion with someone, and then the first thing that will happen is they will immediately descend into the emotional realm. They leave the realm of logic and reason and well-reasoned positions and arguments based upon facts, and they descend into emotion. And the reason they do that is because they don't have a true grasp on the reasons for why they believe what they believe. They've just adopted someone else's opinion as a parrot sitting on their shoulder saying, this is what I believe, this is what I believe. And the truth is, when you scrape away the surface layer, you find that it's hollow. And, you never want to be caught in that position. You always want to be knowledgeable enough about what you believe so that you have a foundational reason for why you believe that. But then you also want to study their positioning so that when you have studied that, you are in a position to know what arguments they're going to come up with, number one. Number two, know why they think that. And then 3, be in a position to debunk those arguments. That's as simple as I can make it. Okay, student loan debt owed to the federal government since the federal government took over or nationalized, I should say, the student loan industry in the United States of America has climbed at a staggering rate, ladies and gentlemen. Since President Obama took office in 2009, the student debt that is currently outstanding, that is owed to the government now, not the total student debt outstanding, but the amount that's actually owed to the government. In other words, that which the taxpayers are responsible for, right? That has climbed by 463%. This is off of a story that is posted out by CNSnews.com. That's Charlie November Sierra News.com. Great website, by the way. I encourage you to get out there and utilize this as one of your sources for information. Because, yes, they're biased, and they're biased in a conservative slant. But I got to tell you, they'll tell you stuff that the mainstream media is not telling anyone. I mean, they're out there lifting up the rug and looking under the corner and finding all the piles of dust and dirt and the dead beetles that nobody wants to talk about in the mainstream ministry of propaganda. So I like their site for that reason. 463% increase since President Obama took office in 2009. And here's the problem. Listen to what the figure is. When he took office, it was 120 billion. Let's just round the numbers. It was $120 billion. Okay? Now, that's a lot of money for the government to be on the hook for. But, in the overall scheme, when we talk about budgets, it's a flea on the elephant's hiney, so to speak, right? But when we talk about what it is now, it is $675 billion. Ladies and gentlemen, that is well over $500 billion and on its way to $750 billion. We taxpayers are on the hook for. That's a stunning increase. I mean, it climbed at a rate of, 1 or 2% over the course of the Bush years, as an example. But when Obama took office and nationalized the student loan program, and he did nationalize it. Let me tell you what they did. If you're not aware of this, you should be. The federal government banned banks from loaning direct on federal student loans. And the only way now that your child or your nephew or niece or grandson or granddaughter or whatever can get a student loan is to apply through the federal government. And this was all part of the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act. It was one of the laws that partially made up Obamacare. And in it, the federal government gave themselves complete control over all federal student loans for education. Period. 100% dictatorial control. Well, I've got a couple of problems with that. For one thing, it is a violation of the principles, and not just the principles, but the legal issues surrounding free trade, and also the Sherman Act. The Sherman Act is an antitrust act that says that nobody can be in a position where they have, a monopoly, if you will, right? Well, you've heard me contend, if you've listened to me for any period of time, you've heard me say it repeatedly. You cannot have a monopoly without government intervention and manipulation in the system, because only the government can create and allow monopolies to, 1, occur, and 2, to flourish. You only have a monopoly when government involvement in the marketplace creates that scenario for a monopoly through legislation. In other words, why is it you can only have one telephone company, one electric provider, one gas provider, just to use those as an example? Why is it that, you are required to buy telephone service from one provider in your marketplace? Now, the government will from time to time say, okay, we're going to deregulate an industry. Remember when they deregulated long distance? You remember when AT&T used to be the only company that you could buy long distance from? That's how they got their start, right? They broke up the Bells. They said, the Bells have a monopoly, and we're going to break up the Bell telephone companies. And that's how you got Southwestern Bell and Bell Atlantic and, Pacific Bell and all these other Bells, right? And they said, okay, so the Bells are going to provide local services. We're going to give AT&T exclusively the long-distance business. And that continued for a decade. AT&T was enriched beyond Bill Gates' wildest dreams. Then they said, okay, we're going to break this up and allow competitors into the marketplace and so forth and so on because we're going to deregulate. Well, with all due respect, you shouldn't have regulated in the first place, because by regulation, you also effectively created a scenario where you're in violation of your own Sherman Act. That's the one that makes a monopoly illegal, right? It's allegedly supposed to be pro-competition legislation so that you can't have another Standard Oil. The truth of the matter is, the antitrust acts and the antitrust legislation in the United States, while it's called antitrust, like everything else in government, it's a misnomer. It's a euphemism for the exact opposite of what it is. When I say that, I want you to think of the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. Well, is anyone finding this affordable? No. So when you hear a name from government that is used to name an act, almost invariably you can turn it upside down on its head, and now it makes sense to you. And when you talk about the Sherman Act, it's antitrust legislation. What, in fact, it really does is it opens the door for government to pick the winners and losers, and through crony capitalism, choose who the winners are going to be. And they create the monopoly. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a distortion of the free market. It's a distortion of the concepts of free enterprise. And it is why we've never really truly had capitalism in this nation. We've never had it. I mean, laissez-faire capitalism, if you want to look at that, you bring out the word laissez-faire and people start giving you the old, vampire crossed finger thing. Laissez-faire means zero regulation. Completely free market, Wild West. The truth is, we've never actually attempted it. We've never had a scenario where we had true unfettered capitalism and an unfettered free enterprise free market, ever. And free market principles are what made the country great. I mean, free market principles are what helped the United States of America in the last 237 years drag the rest of the world, and I'll grant you this is a bold statement, but we've dragged the rest of the world kicking and screaming out of the Stone Age. So how can it be bad? But what we don't have is true free enterprise and capitalism. We have this distorted quasi-free marketplace. And it's distorted because the government, it's like taking a bubble, right? If you could take a balloon and you put your finger, a balloon is a perfect sphere because, assuming that the rubber around it is all uniform in thickness and so forth, that balloon is a perfect sphere. Okay. If you take your finger and you hold a balloon and you insert and push your finger, you distort the shape of the sphere. And government intervention through antitrust oxymoronish type programs like the Sherman Act actually distort the marketplace. And this is no different. So now what we have is a government who is, for all intents and purposes, eliminated a significant chunk of the marketplace from the free market. The government is now in charge of all student loans. You cannot apply for a student loan unless you go through the federal government. Hey, folks, if that's not hijacking a big, significant chunk of the economy, I don't know what is. Now, there are those who will say, well, that's not true. You can still go to a bank and get a loan. That's right. You could go to a bank if you're well-heeled enough and say, listen, Bob, you and I have been friends for 20 years. I got a lot of money in your bank. I do a lot of business with you. I need a student loan to get my kid into Harvard or Yale or Brown or whatever other university he's going to go to. And I don't want to go through the federal government. I just want to get a loan from you because you're my local banker. And he says, great. If you want to sign on it personally, we'll give you the loan. But that's different than a student who says, hey, I'm doing this on my own. I'm just graduating high school, and I need a student loan to go on to college. So what we have is a government that has completely distorted the free market and free enterprise. And they've done it in repeated areas, but this particular one is egregious because our debt, the debt that we as taxpayers are on the hook for, has grown 463% in 5 years. No, I'm sorry, even less than that, 4 years. Now, the direct student loan program is what this is called. And it went into effect actually July 1 in 2010. So it's 3 years really. It's even less than that. At that time, the amount of outstanding loans was $178,000 and some change. Let's call it 178,000. 178 billion. Now for the record, it is, put your socks on, 675 billion. I mean, that's just the way that this program works is the federal government is the banker, and it's like a monopoly game. There's only one banker to go to. It provides the loans that students obtain, and it still requires all the same stuff that your family sign on for it, and if you don't have enough credit and all that kind of thing. But it uses federal monies from the Treasury, and which of course taxpayers are required to cough up, and it actually owns those loans. Now, arguably, some would say, well, that puts the government in charge of business. It's a good thing we're getting interest on that. Stop right there. Has the government ever fiscally managed your money correctly? Do you expect that today they're going to start? I mean, realistically, they don't operate like a business. They don't manage and maintain their books like a business. If they did, they would be required to utilize the same principles, the same accounting principles that every company in the nation is required legally to abide by. Generally accepted accounting principles, that's GAAP, right? Generally accepted accounting principles are the principles that every corporation on the planet must adhere to maintain their books. Yet the federal government refuses staunchly to follow GAAP. Why is that? And how is it that you, as an accountant or a corporation or an owner of a business who decides to play, let's play double books, can go to jail for that, but the government can't? And you don't have the police power to nationalize your entire marketplace. This is why we are sliding in towards totalitarianism in this nation. And it's incremental in its scope and in its scale. It's always like the frog boiling in the pot, right? You know the old adage, you got a pot there, it's at room temperature, you toss a frog in there, and he sits there happily and croaks away. And you turn the heat on, and you turn it on very low, and slowly but surely the water heats up. And because the frog doesn't have the ability to sense that the water is heating up around him, he stays in there until he boils. On the other hand, if the water was already boiling and you whip the frog in there, he'd jump right out again because he'd recognize instantaneously that it was hot. But under a graduated scenario, he never quite recognizes what's happening to him until it's too late. When we look at the nationalizing of entire areas of our economy, when we look at the nationalizing of federal land, right? How about the Bureau of Land Management? They own, unbelievable percentages of the United States. It's like, 40% or something like that. I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head. You can look them up yourself. But And on that property is what? A lot of natural resources. So now the government is in the position of being the holder and the owner of all these natural resources that, guess what? They won't let anybody go drill on. Why are we buying oil from OPEC? Because the government says you can't drill on this. It's another distortion of the free market. If that land was in private hands, a company would be able to go over to the landowner and say, hey, you got 1,000 acres out there. Maybe you got 10,000 acres out there. You got a lot of oil and natural gas under there. I'd like to tap into it, and I'll cut you in for a slice of the profits. What do you say? And the government, when you approach them with that same perspective, they say, oh, no, not really. We're not going to go there. And you don't have any choice or even discussion in the matter. There's no way you can appeal to them because it's a policy decision. It's not a question motivated by profitability for a private landowner. The same applies when we're talking about the nationalization of our student loan scenario. First of all, you took the profit away from banks. And I'm no friend of banks. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. But I am saying that there was a profit that ended up going back into the economy that now does not. Number one. Number two, because government does not operate on the same principles as industry and the public, they're not accountable for the money. So they don't really care whether the student ever pays it back or not. Because, hey, you know what? The taxpayers are going to pay it. It's all just Treasury money. Don't worry about it. And they are that flippant about it. Trust me. The fact that in our last segment, we just covered that $250 billion a year is lost to fraud and abuse out of our entitlement programs tells you everything you need to know. 25%. I mean, that's staggering. Out of $1 trillion a year, which we spend on entitlement programs for Medicare and Medicaid and whatever, Social Security, welfare, not Social Security. Stop. It's not part of it. But Medicare and Medicaid and welfare and all the rest, we're talking about $250 billion a year lost. I just did the math. That's $2,500 per taxpayer per year. So we're on the hook for this. Not to mention the fact that you've isolated an entire industry, quite honestly. It's an entire industry. Make no mistake about it. The student loan industry was an industry into itself. And it also does one other aspect of this, which is damaging to the society and the fabric of our nation. It gives government the approval, the ability to say it's okay going forward to isolate and annex in to government's control other segments of the economy. In other words, it's like the old adage that, the first murder is the difficult one, but after that they all get easy kind of thing. The problem that we have here is that direct loan financing should not be a perspective from should not be a government-owned entity, and it is totalitarianism. It's nationalizing the system. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it socialism. You can call it communism. You can call it fascism. I don't care what ism you label it with. When you talk about the government taking over entire segments of the economy, it is a totalitarianistic or authoritarianistic element, period. And there's no other way to look at it. The fact that they did this successfully, according to them, on the student loan aspect was one of the things and one of the motivators for them to do it on the healthcare aspect, where we're not talking about now a small sliver of a percentage lost in the overall budget. Here we're talking about a whole sixth of the American economy. 1/6 of a $16 trillion economy has been completely removed. And mark my words, when the move comes to go to single payer, and it will come, it will get to universal health care. I mean, I can give you documented examples of Obama stating that back as far as 2003, long before he ever had presidential, he probably had presidential aspirations, but long before he was ever a gleam in the presidential eye of anyone, he was saying back then that he approved of the idea of universal single payer healthcare systems, where government is equivalent to the one and only stop, the one and only banker on the monopoly table. So we know that's the goal, and we've heard Congress people say that right out boldly. What we have is a frog boiling in the pot. It's a little here, it's a little there. And we are sliding into totalitarianism. Now when you combine that with some other things that are coming out, the education system. I'm going to talk about that next when we talk about debunking Common Core. But mark my words, Common Core is a federal program. And already the Department of Education in Washington, which has by the way, ladies and gentlemen, a $100 billion a year budget. $100 billion. Where does that money come from? It comes from the individual states. The Department of Education gets it. They scrape their percentage off the top in true gangland thug style, and then they distribute it back to the states with a lot of mandates associated to it. How insane is that? When you look at it from that perspective, when you step back from the forest and you get above the trees, you can see the lay of the land. We're in danger. Our nation is in exigent danger of sliding into authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And I cannot encourage you strongly enough to educate yourself about what our real true motives and intentions were in the founding and the designation of this country as a constitutional republic. Because a constitutional republic declares that government must be small in order for the people to yield big. And the entire dichotomy has been turned on its head. The entire picture has been flipped in a dichotomy that changes the nature. This healthcare bill changes your role and your relationship to government. You are no longer the master. You are now subservient. And that's exactly how the globalists, the elitists, and the political class want it. They want you subservient to them. That can never be acceptable to America. It cannot be. Congress has no right to make a law that is outside the constitutional authorities granted and delegated to Congress by the states and the people themselves. The Obamacare compels every citizen to engage in commerce. You're compelled. You don't have a choice. It's done by the police power of the government. Well, I got to tell you something. John Adams made a very, very astute quote, and I'm going to read it to you. If men, through fear, fraud, or mistake, should in terms renounce and give up any essential natural right, the eternal law of reason and the great end of society would absolutely vacate such a renunciation. And the right to freedom, being the gift of God Almighty, it is not in the power of man to alienate this gift and voluntarily become a slave. Wow. Let's paraphrase that for a moment, just so we get away from some of the old English. If men are coerced through fear, fraud, or mistake, and renounce or give up any of their essential natural rights, the eternal laws of reason mean that they later, upon discovering that they have renounced that right, have the right to vacate that renunciation and say, stop, I was tricked. The terms of the contract were not as originally presented to me. And therefore, my right to freedom, being an unalienable gift of God and nature, says that I have it within my power as man to alienate this gift, to alienate this contract and to remove myself voluntarily from the position of slavery. Boom. If men, through fear, coercion, right, fraud or mistake, should in terms renounce and give up any essential natural right, the eternal law of reason and the great end of society would absolutely vacate such a renunciation. The right to freedom being the gift of Almighty God, it is not in the power of man to voluntarily become a slave. Hey, folks, it's this simple. We have the unalienable rights that all humans have. It's not just limited to those people in the United States, by the way. Everyone has the rights of free speech and the rights of self-defense and the rights to pursue your own life in the way in which you choose and to benefit from the fruit of your labor. The only difference between us and them is we have actually ensconced this into a document that gives us some guidance, some boundaries, right? In other words, it's like, canyon walls, and we can stay within these canyon walls and know that we're safe as long as we don't venture off the trail of the constitutional guideposts. But we've been tricked, we've been manipulated, and we have been coerced into giving up those rights which we don't even have the right to give up. We cannot waive them. You can waive them in a piece of paper, but you cannot universally, in a universal sense of things, you cannot waive your right and voluntarily enter into slavery. And if you do, and it's done via fraud, fear, coercion, or a mistake, you have the right to extricate yourself from that position, declare your liberty and your freedom, and go back to the unalienable rights of freedom, liberty, and truth. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a powerful concept. This is our country. This is our nation. And we have a right to put it back the way it should be, to put the pieces back in place. John Adams wrote that in 1772, called Rights of the Colonists. This is before 1776 now. If men through fear, fraud, or mistake should in terms renounce or give up any essential natural right, the eternal law of reason and the great end of society would absolutely vacate such renunciation, the right to freedom being the gift of Almighty God. It is not in the power of man to alienate this gift and voluntarily become a slave. Holy smoke. That's like getting punched right in the jaw. All right, we're going to take a break. When we return, we're going to talk about Common Core. Because the claims out there from the 46 states who have signed on for Common Core is that they're trying to get it passed. I mean, the national uprising over Common Core, if you're not aware of it, is huge. And the states are out there saying, well, you know, this is a state-led effort. It's really not a national effort. Bunk. Don't buy it for a second. It is an absolute lie being perpetrated upon you. Like we just talked about, it's the frog on the pot mentality. The federal government is already in charge of all nationalized education. And I got to tell you, they're unconstitutionally usurping that authority. It doesn't belong to the federal government. It belongs to the states, and it belongs to the individuals. We're going to cover that in a moment. You're listening to America's Voice Now. You can find us on the web by going to americasvoicenow.org. And then you can also find us on our Facebook page. I strongly ask you to go to our Facebook page because when you do that, it gives us an opportunity to, and you hit the like button. You know, when we post stuff up there, it gets posted onto your timeline, and then people on your sphere of influence can read it. Well, one way that you can share your knowledge and education and help influence those people are in your own personal circle of influence is by simply liking our Facebook page. Because when we post an article or a story up there, it shows up on your timeline. You never know who in your circle is going to say, wow, that's interesting. Let me click on that and find out what that's all about. Boom. We just brought another person to awakening. And that's what our job is. That's what we're here for. To bring others to awakening and awareness. We have an obligation to do that. We'll be right back. We're going to return in just a moment. If you're catching us on our audio podcast, stick with us. We're just going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. If you're watching us live on the web, we'll take a quick break. We'll pause the video for a moment and wait 30 seconds and then hit the play button, and you'll be able to pick it up where you left off. You're listening to America's Voice Now. Find us on Facebook.com/America's Voice Now, YouTube.com/America's Voice Now. You can share those videos with your friends as well. And you can also find our website directly where we post everything up there, and that is americasvoicenow.org. We'll be right back.